just to give a bit of input why we were interested to do this webinar, also to learn for ourselves, because we are not the experts on the topic, but we had the feeling that this is and this is very relevant for our community, for better legislation, for smoother implementation, and the topics that we are working on. So maybe just a small scene setter. What we understand under regulatory sandboxes, and that they allow public or private actors to test innovations in a controlled real-world environment. Real world in brackets, because but there the colleagues I think will tell you more than, and sometimes it might even not be real world, but in some cases yes, and under a specific plan. So really the boundaries, as a children's sandbox, you have clear boundaries of the sandbox. It's not a beach. And it's monitored by a competent authority. Yeah, also the sandbox picture, the parents or other people. And they usually include temporary loosening of applicable rules. So it might be that in the sandbox you're allowed to do things that you are not allowed to do outside the sandbox. And there are some safeguards in sandboxing clauses, for example, on security. But also here, I think our colleagues are much more, that they will come later, and that we have invited the experts. They will tell you more and be more precise around this. I just wanted to highlight why we think it's important to consider this and to have policymakers know more about regulatory sandboxes, because they allow for testing digital implementation before drafting legal requirements. This means you can see if what you have in mind, what you want to do, is really implementable, and what it takes to have it implementable. And this is, of course, most relevant for the new technologies like artificial intelligence, and this is also why we invited the colleague from DG Connect, who has been working on the proposal for the IA Act of the Commission, and that contains such a regulatory sandboxing clause. But it might also be interesting for other settings, and not just for exclusively for testing IA, but also other technologies. And then there is also, this is like the before setting, but also when you're drafting it, we think there's one message to policymakers could be, and actually this is also a message that we have included in the better regulation guidelines that we have talked about in other webinars, that the Commission has this kind of a better regulation guidelines and a toolbox where we advise policymakers on how to do how to design their policies. We are somehow the owners of the Better Regulation Tool 28 on digital ready policymaking, and there we have put the message that when you design your policy, think about whether a nice little sandboxing clause can help in this policy field to move towards innovation, to test new solutions, and to have like an agile policymaking process. So this is the second message. So it can help you before drafting, and then in the when you draft, it can also help you to enable future sandboxes. And we really think the community, and why is it relevant for our better regulation for better legislation for smoother implementation community? Here we think it's really an opportunity. Those sandboxes, they are often also put into contexts where you work together with different administrations, so they are an opportunity to learn from each other, to work in multidisciplinary teams. And there is much going on in Europe, very interesting best practices, and our community is about bringing those best practices together. And I think our first intervention from Lorna from DG RTD, she will tell you a bit more about what is ongoing on EU level, and what the Council, for example, has already, why the Council is very interested in the topic also. But before we move into us telling or our experts telling you more about the topic, we want to know more about you. We always start this with this very, very high-level question: what is your professional background? Because we want to be a multidisciplinary community, and we are interested what topics sometimes we have a very nice mix of people coming from the policymaking, legal world, from business. From the business requirements worlds, and then from the IT world, and this is for our statistics or also to see for the speakers what audience do we have in front of us. So please switch to Slido and tell us a bit about you. I think you have to press the green button. Yes. And maybe I can tell you a bit about the backgrounds of this of our legal interoperability team. So we really have the three. I'm a lawyer. My colleague Sophia, who started is from the policy. Is a policy maker since a long time, and then we have the business with Sophia, with Cecile. She just came in the picture, and this is Sophia. So we have we are not. Cecile, it's a bit, maybe we lack the very strong IT, but as we are working in an IT department, in an IT DG, we can always get this from the colleagues. So.
But it's beautiful to see that we have exactly this mixture. As you see, all of you scrolling the professional backgrounds, I already saw policy, IT, engineer, evaluation policy officer now. So this excellent, really. And I just, to our panelists or speakers, I would like to already point out that we have a question from Xavier. Could you please share some example of legal requirements that took lessons learned from regulatory sandboxes as input? So if you happen to have, maybe it's ambitious, because I think that we are very much at the beginning of the journey of having regulatory reporting or regulatory sandboxes clauses. But if you happen to know about a concrete example where already a sandbox brought results and this was factored back to legislation, please do share with us throughout your presentation. And I hand back to Isa and maybe the next question.
I see that there's also somebody from the culture field, so very interesting mix. Yeah, we can jump to the next questions once did we scroll through all of them? So but we will share also after the webinar, then you can also have a look to who was there. So and next question is, what is your experience with regulatory sandboxes? I saw some already said they are really working on the topic, but this will also help our speakers to say, to see where they have to start. Okay, so a lot of beginners. And Cecile, do you want to contribute?
Yes, I wanted to say that to come back to the question of Xavier, we can also, in case the panelists cannot have no concrete case, it could be a field of investigation for us for the next future.
I think it might be that Constantine, who's our second speaker, has, because they have it at least on their list that this should be the case in the future, but I don't know if they have concrete examples yet.
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Super, but I also agree with Cecile. This is the spirit of our community. So we really want to co-create knowledge together. So if we cannot find an answer here today, we will post it in the community JoinUp space, and we can then see the answers there. Yeah, I mute myself.
Okay, maybe we can jump to the next question. So
just for this one, we see that Italy wants to get inspired by Germany, I guess. So that's nice.
Okay, but once some are getting started, so we are really in this inception phase where there is a need to learn from each other. And just the final question, what are your expectations for the webinar? But I guess it's mostly then learn from each other. But I will see, we will see. And really this exchange for us is really important. So if you come in, if you want to come and share your experience, I think we have the time in this webinar to do so. And also you should know that our community or JoinUp page where you have also registered is an open, JoinUp is an open community. Everybody can register and then share content on the platform. And we really would love to have your content also on our JoinUp space. And if you have problems putting it technically, you contact us and we help you. So learn, share, grow together, learn about sandboxes and how to, and their implementation. And we have a lot of different members that we haven't asked this question. We also often ask where do we come, where do people come from? But from the participants list, I saw that we have a good coverage of EU and some even from beyond, from the other side of the world. And then for them, it's maybe mid of the night. So thank you for being with us. And yeah, we have learn about concrete examples in the area of agriculture, food and rural development. So we will see if the speakers have examples from this field. Can you scroll down a bit if there is anything more? Okay, then I would say the legal barriers. I think there may be also Constantine might have. I think both the Constantine and also our last intervention from Jrc talking about the IA example will have. You will learn a bit about how the data privacy issue is addressed, because it's always at this. I would say like a standard part of a regulatory sandbox clause.
Okay, but being the timekeeper for today, Isa, I suggest that we really go into the heart of our topic. So
okay,
let's move on.
Let's move on, and we then will start with our colleague Lorna Schäffler, who she's coming from the DG RTD, our Director General in the Commission, who's responsible for innovation, and we have invited her because she has worked on the Council has issued an opinion about regulatory sandboxes and asked the Commission to do to follow up on this, and this is what she has been doing. And now we want to hear from her what was the outcome, and also it's in her hand, and what is the Commission doing about regulatory sandboxes. So, Lorna, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and good morning to everybody. Please tell me if you don't hear me well. No, normally the connection should be fine, but you never know.
Now it's good.
So it's a pleasure to be with you. I see some familiar names, and before there were cameras on, so faces as well. So for some of you, what I will be saying will not be entirely new. For others, I hope to answer part of the questions that were put in the chat, including on the concrete examples from recent experiences. So you see the title is relatively extended, although the focus today is on sandboxes. But as was just mentioned, the starting point for our work that we did together with the Secretariat General of the Commission was to follow up on the Council conclusions. Next slide, please. Yes. So some of you might know that in November, at the end of November 2020, the Council issued some conclusions where it basically did I mean, there are many topics covered in the conclusion, but for today's seminar, I think what is important to know is, on the one hand, the Council provided some definition of what are experimentation clauses and regulatory sandboxes, and you can see them on the slide. I will not, of course, read them, but the idea here is that before you have a sandbox, which is, as Cecile was explaining before, something like a structured setting for experimentation with some safeguards and some time frame and scope that are defined under supervisory authority. You often have a legal base, and this is a little bit the open question that we have today. How would you draft, getting practical, this legal base? And Constantine will speak about that a bit later. But the idea here is that the legislation allows you for some space of experimentation. Now, and this is normally termed experimentation clauses, and we have them already in our better regulation toolbox since already a couple of years back. And they are basically parts of the legislation that allow for some flexibility. Now, will this flexibility lead always to a sandbox or to other form of experimentation, which can also be equally useful for policymaker? That is a bit of a question that has to be answered on a case-by-case basis. The other important aspect of the Council conclusions, on top of the definitions that were provided, were, of course, the mandate that it gave the Commission, which was the starting point for our work, and what I will basically be sharing with you today, which was to take stock of what experimentation clauses and sandboxes exist at EU level, but also to prepare the ground for exchanging experiences, lessons with member states, and ideally come up, that's what was the Council intention, with some concrete recommendation on the way forward. So I will anticipate that, because what we found is all quite recent, issuing strong evidence-based recommendations was not possible at the outcome of this stock taking that we did last year. However, a lot of things have been put in motion, and I think this seminar is another example of the fact that the topic is very much on the attention, and things are evolving in this field much faster than could be maybe expected in 2020 when the conclusions were issued. Next slide, please. So what did the Commission do to follow up on the Council? Well, basically, we set up what we call an inter-service group. So all the Directorate Generals, or ministers, for those who are not familiar with the ministries, for those who are not familiar with the structure of the Commission, were contacted and asked to send a representative that is knowledgeable in the topic, or has a grasp of their own legislation or their better regulation practices, to try to understand what is going on in each policy field. Most DGs responded, so it was quite a nice group. And we met, of course, online, thanks to COVID. And we basically collected everything that we could find, and we decided a little bit to, first of all, understand what it is that we're talking about. And this was important because the Council conclusion gave indeed some definition, but when you apply to the EU setting, not everything might be captured by this definition, because the EU competencies are based on the treaty. Each field has its own way of operating, its own governance, also between the EU level and the national level. So it's important to understand what is the animal that we are supposed to see in this panorama. And maybe there are other animals, like these experimentation clauses, which we might miss if we stick to a strict definition where we look for a legal basis that allow for setting up a sandbox. So that was a little bit what we started doing in the very beginning. And also to understand that there are things that look experimental in EU legislation, but in fact are not there with the purpose of testing a new innovation, maybe giving some lenience or regulatory requirements. Although when you just look at the legal test, they might appear to be so. And what I'm talking here is maybe longer transposition deadlines in directive that allow adaptation or phasing in of requirements. This is not for experimentation purposes, but sometimes they look similar in legal terms because they were drafted 10, 20, 30 years ago. So it was really important to set the record straight from the beginning. so that we could develop a questionnaire that we then shared also with the member states to basically collect this information in the different departments. And then, and I see some colleagues from the council presidency, the member states did the same, and in autumn completed the collection at the national level. We set a time frame for looking backwards at 10 years because we didn't expect to find very much in earlier phases, or because the legislation would have been probably revised in any case. So the next slide. So this is what we found. Now I focus mostly on sandboxes because this is the topic of today. As we kind of expected, that was a little bit what we were saying in the first meeting. Well, sandboxes, I'm not quite sure we have some. And indeed, in terms of concrete already running sandboxes, well, at the EU level, this is quite new. So we did find some experimentation clauses on a legal base, paving the way for sandboxes, and one we will hear extensively from Jordanka later on artificial intelligence, which, however, had been basically adopted when the inter-service group was ongoing. So it's not yet applied, of course. And then, of course, one of the fields where we already knew we would find more is in the financial services. And here you have the pilot regime for market infrastructure based on DLT. So the idea is basically to allow certain class of securities to be exchanged through DLT, settled through DLT, which is basically an amendment of the current practice in the financial services, and is to allow to test this distributed ledger technology. So a bit in the spirit of the seminar, how does it work if you digitalize or use a new technology in something that currently is occurring in a different manner? And then, to our surprise, there was a question I saw on agriculture and before in the chat. We found one example from the area of food safety on cereal seeds, which of course was not drafted when sandboxes were a fancy topic. Nobody heard about them before. So they are drafted in a different way, but de facto they allow for experimenting in a controlled and limited time and setting for certain cereal seeds. So this is also an interesting area because, of course, the technological and digital development cycle is different from applying a sandbox to natural cycles like agriculture. There you might need to take things in consideration, which is a bit what I will be repeating every time, that the lessons learned may slightly vary on a case by case basis because of the technicalities and specificities of each sectors. Now, of course, while we were looking, we also see quite clearly, and the member states and the council colleagues can maybe intervene later if they want to complement, but things were popping up on our radar as well, coming from the national level. In some sector, of course, in finance, we already knew that fintech was, fintech sandboxes exist in several member states. At the time it was 10, maybe now it's a little bit more. But also we could see that while we didn't necessarily find something on energy at the EU level, a lot was going on at the national level, for instance, on peer-to-peer exchange of electricity or other more localized examples. And the same was for the case of transport. And Germany was a very good example with already quite a few running sandboxes, which we might hear from later on. Next slide. So this is basically what we found. So we tried to draw some lessons already because this is what was our mandate. So we also have to say that although the sandboxes were quite limited, we found various experimentation clauses in sectors like mobility, etc. Aviation, there was a little bit. And of course, there were other things going on which were not necessarily legally based, but basically following the same spirit. So everything has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and the implementation also varied in this respect. The other important element that is my second bullet point on the slide is here, that there may be more under going on than what the radar could pick up. Why? Because older experimentation clauses may have been there. They may be may have been used, but because the attention when you evaluate this legislation and how it was implemented was not necessarily on experimentation, you may not find much on existing impact assessment, evaluation, or analysis of how this legislation was used for experimentation, because maybe the focus was on something else. Now, of course, this is going to change. We expect, indeed, because there is at OECD level, at Commission level, in the member states, much more attention for agile regulation, future-proof regulation, the fact that we don't always want to run behind innovations, but we want to make sure that we are flexible enough to accommodate them when they help us achieve policy goals like those in the Green Deal, for instance. And the other thing is, of course, as I was mentioning, there's a lot of things that are planned or ongoing, and it's a constantly evolving panorama. So, for instance, some of you have heard about the Jrc Living Labs. This is not exactly a sandbox, but it has some commonalities with them, and they are basically living laboratories with testing with users on the spot that are put up in the sites of ISPRA and PETEN at the JRC, in mobility and in the energy field. And of course, they can be a laboratory for building a sandbox maybe at a later stage for the policymakers to draw lesson from. There is at DG Connect, the European blockchain services infrastructure that is being put up. Maybe it doesn't have exactly the same legal basis as a sandbox, but there is a lot going on in this field. And as we speak, other things are being put up. I put here the sustainable and smart mobility strategy from in the mobility sector. There is the EU digital finance platform, which is being set up and will be more operational in the second half of this year, and will allow to connect cross-border experiences with sandboxing in the financial services at the national level. And last week, we saw, or some of you may have seen, that there was a communication in the area of energy where sandboxes are also mentioned. So as we speak, things are changing compared to what the stock taking was indicating. And basically, what we also learned is that when we look comparatively at what was going on at the member state level and what is going on at the EU level, there are some commonalities. You see usual suspect sectors that are popping up more frequently, so energy, transport, finance, and digitalization of different aspects. The other common element that is quite important is the role of the supervisor, because the sandboxing remains something that has to be structured and safeguarded. The idea is not here to deregulate for the sake of deregulating. It's really more to potentially lift or alter regulatory requirements to learn and improve the policies. So of course, the role of the supervisory authority is crucial. There is also the need for innovation to be a genuine innovation, because that's the purpose of testing and on allowing this flexibility. And we could see that often this testing is limited in time, also because you need to draw lessons and conclusions for it. What we also learned, of course, is that since this is very new, we ended up sometimes with more questions than we entered the exercise with. And one of the key questions that applies, and you find it in the literature also beyond Europe, is scaling up. What do you do to extract what you see in the sandbox? How does it play out in the real world? How it will evolve if you put it on the market for real? The other questions that were important and more peculiar to the EU setting is, what is the link between the EU and the national experiments or sandboxes in the same field? Sometimes there are no links. Sometimes there are. How do you deal with them in the future? How do you deal with them in legislation, which is a question that we haven't found an answer yet for. Next slide, please. So just to give you the conclusions of this overview is, well, the experience is still limited. So as I just said a minute ago, we found some common features, and I think this makes the panorama clearer for us to move forward and understand what we need to explore. And one of these areas is indeed the link between national and EU level experiences. The other important conclusion that I cannot stress enough is that although sandboxes are extremely useful in some cases, they are one of the tools for experimenting and making space for innovation. There are other options on the menu which are sometimes faster to implement or equally useful in certain circumstances. And all the efforts that are being done to improve the quality of the regulatory framework are also important. The better regulation, the fact that now that we know that experimentation is important, innovation is important, we will look at these existing experimentation clauses with different eyes. We will see how to potentially improve them, make them evolve. And of course, at the EU level, what we have already done is, of course, indeed to monitor proposals in the pipeline, but in the revised better regulation toolbox, we have now, you will find a tool on sandboxes, which provides some guidance for policy officers who may be drafting an evaluation or an impact assessment, and where it turns out that now, in the current circumstances, a sandbox is a possible valuable option to include in the policy being designed. And of course, the next steps would be to continue this thought taking, because as I said, it keeps moving. It's a panorama that keeps evolving. And of course, to exchange the information of the members with the member states. So the next slide. This is, I will not spend time on this because you can easily find it in the better regulation toolbox. But basically, here is what I just mentioned a minute ago. This is the first, and it was not there until last year, set of guidelines to help policy officers or policymakers in the Commission consider whether a sandbox may be useful in some of their policies. But this is just a part of the stories, as the colleagues here were saying, because then you also need the experience on how to draft this legally. And I think the next presenters will be of help in this respect. So that's all for me. I'm happy to take any question. I saw there was one on whether there was anything changed as a result of a sandbox. At the national level, I think there might have been one case, but they all are almost at the very most between 2 and 5 years old. So it's very hard to find an example where there has been a consequence on the legislation, because it's all very new. So I'm happy to take your questions, and thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much, Lorna. This was also very informative for me, and I also already know that I will come back to you after the webinar with some questions also. But it does, and now the floor is to the audience. So if you have questions to Lorna, please come in and ask them. We have put the in the chat, you can see that the better regulation guidelines, we have put a link so you can better find them in the chat. Miguel, do you want to come in and ask your question directly? I see you put one in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Isa. My question is more because me in the past, I was involved in a large-scale pilot at EU level on the mutual recognition of EIDs, electronic identification, and it was impossible to have in the, let's say, pre-operational phase to play around with the national ID cards because of this kind of regulatory framework of sandbox or whatever, allowing us to use actual data of citizens, to plug in actual citizens to play around with this new IT system. So my question is, if based on your experience, Lorna, it's a case-by-case basis, you said, but if we need to experiment, at the end of the day, we are digitalizing services in Digit, for instance, and we need to exchange data. And also we are playing with data formats, and at the end of the day, we need to use actual data. And this data might have personal information behind. What is your view on this? Is this feasible? Have you seen experiences along these lines?
So in terms of part of your question will be answered with a concrete example by Jordanka later on, because of course with artificial intelligence, this was a crucial element as well when developing the proposal. So in the examples that I've seen often in the member states, the idea is that you might play with actual data. I think there were cases in in social security very limited, but they existed in some of the Scandinavian countries. And probably there the safeguard is always that the participant agrees that their data are played with, but then the security level from the regulator, meaning in this case the data protection authority plus the ministry having those data for the purpose that they were collected, have to be very, very, very strongly enforced. But another area where you, of course, have data is in the smart mobility, but it's all quite new. So I would not comment on how to legally craft this, because I think there are more qualified colleagues than me commenting on this later. But indeed, there is a little purpose for experimenting if you can't use the real data. So there must be a technical way probably that has to be carefully analyzed, and I'm not a digit expert, of course, you can anonymize them, I'm sure. Or was this even a problem, even in an anonymized format? In this case that you were talking about, because another issue that comes up, I mean, data seems to be the first thing that comes to mind that is tricky, but you have to bear in mind that in other areas, the key question, at least for sandboxing at the EU level, is the internal market. So it has nothing to do with the data, it has to do with fragmentation. What happens if you treat an innovation differently under the same regulation in different member states? So this is another question that you need to look at legally. So there are various difficulties, but the data, I think, is going to have to be solved, because a lot of what is being sandboxed is going to involve data.
Thank you very much, Lorna. So I think you already raised the expectations for what is coming next, and that's some questions. And I also see a new question in the chat from Fabio from Eurostat, and I think it's not a naive question. That he says, I can hardly think of a regulatory sector which does not have to face innovation and digitalization, and this is exactly the message from our community. And that means that there should also be such clauses that are relevant for all sectors, and if there should not be a standard clause. And Lorna, I mean, you can give a short statement on this, but I think Constantine is somebody who is actually working on such a standard clause. So if you don't mind, I would maybe just move on and give the question to him.
No problem.
Okay, so let's move to our next speaker then, and have this question be answered by him if he thinks a standard clause would be necessary. And this is Dr. Constantine Colloga from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And he is head of the Coordination Office for Regulatory Sandboxes, and he will be talking about the German Regulatory Sandbox Strategy. And I think they have something in the pipeline that is looking into a standard clause. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hear more from him. Constantine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isa. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning from Berlin. I'm very happy to be with you all here today. And thank you for the possibility to talk a bit about the German perspective and on this so important and interesting topic, I guess. Next slide, please. Yes, what I'm going to do today is to tell you about 3 points in general. First, I would like to give you a short overview just about the scene of regulatory sandboxes in Germany, about the practice. Second, I would like to take a closer look on the legal basis on experimentation clauses. And third, I would also like to tell you just a bit, no marketing, about what we do actually and what we're planning, and like what Isa also mentioned. Next slide, please. Yeah, but first, let's start with the questions why do we need regulatory sandboxes? And I think Isa and Lorna have already brought it to the point, but just to tell it again with different words, perhaps with a German perspective. Regulatory sandboxes allow to enable innovation in a real world. And now this here we're especially talking about emerging cutting-edge technologies, oftentimes high-risk applications, high-risk products, services that are oftentimes not fully compliant with the general legal framework. And this is the reason, and Isa also already told this, that we need those experimentation clauses that give the authorities the flexibility for derogations. And the second so important point is that regulatory sandboxes help to advance regulation through evidence, through learning. The regulator can see what the real impact of innovation is in a real world environment, and with this evidence that is gained, they can further advance regulation. And here you see just 9 small pictures. These are the 9 winners from our last year's competition for regulatory sandboxes, 9 short pictures of regulatory sandboxes. And here you see a bit of the variety of possible areas. You see e-government, you see e-health, we had blockchain projects, and the dominant field of application is definitely today the transport and mobility. And so I brought 2 concrete examples from this very interesting sector. So please, next slide. First example is the so-called Hubi. Hubi is a driverless on-demand shuttle bus that was tested in 2019 in the city of Osnabrück in Germany. And the idea is to connect the city of Osnabrück and the urban public transport system of Osnabrück with the remote villages around the city. Via this on-demand shuttle bus. And the point here is that you definitely need even two experimentation clauses, because first thing is that this bus doesn't have a bus driver, and normally you have to have this bus driver. And second, it's not a standardized way of transport, and so you also need this experimentation clause and this special exemption. Second, next slide, please. Second example you see here is the so-called Smala project, also very interesting. In Hamburg, you have the problem, like in other cities, that you have lots of congestion, you have lots of traffic in the city, and the problems that the delivery trucks don't find parking zones and park illegally in the second row or even in the third row. And so the colleagues in Hamburg had the idea to test a virtual booking system that allowed for reserving and for booking certain spaces, certain loading zones with a small app. So a very good idea, but the problem and the reality was you're not allowed. Normally, you're not allowed to reserve or to book a certain loading zone. And so they were lucky that there is also another experimentation clause in the German road traffic regulations, which they could use in order to test this project. And here the interesting thing is that they started with only 4 zones, and they scaled up it to 45 projects and to 45 zones. But they don't only want to scale up the technology, but they also want to scale up the legal surrounding and the legal base. So Hamburg is planning, if the project is project is still running and they're still gathering evidence, but the plan is that they want to bring this idea into the legislation via the German Bundesrat. So they want to, with the knowledge, they want to advance the German road traffic regulations and to make it possible all over Germany, which was what would be I think a very good idea. Okay, so next slide, please. So let's take a closer look on the legal base. Yeah, right. And next slide. So I brought you two. I hope it's not too boring or too concrete, but I brought you two very concrete experimentation clauses. The first thing is the experimentation clause from the Passengers Transportation Act, which was one of the legal basis for the HUBI that you remember from the first slide. This experimentation clause allows for the practical testing of new modes or means of transport, the licensing authority to, upon request and on a case-by-case basis, authorize exemptions from the provisions of this act. So, to cut it short, it's a very open, very flexible formulation that allows regulatory sandboxes in very different kinds of transport. So, for example, you're allowed to test pooling services, ride pooling services. You definitely know Uber Pool, or also on-demand transports like the HUBI bus, like the HUBI shuttle that you've seen before. To give some positive experiences, it was used very frequently in practice. We have many successful projects also still running, like HUBI. And this important, the interesting thing here, and I think this question was raised earlier, we have here an example where the results of those projects help to further amend and to advance the regulation, because in August 2021 the law was amended and the ride pooling services and as well the on-demand transport was transferred into the possibility of regular operation. So today you do not need to take this experimentation clause, but you can have a regular permit to make a ride pooling services or such a on-demand transport bus. So at the same time, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. Let's stay just for a second here. And also interesting was that in this amendment, this experimentation clause was not deleted. So it remains in this law, more something as an entry gate for future forms of transport, perhaps for, what can we imagine? Drones for persons, for the transport of persons, or other very interesting thing. But now, so much for the good side of this experimentation clause. There were also challenges. I told you it's very flexible, it's very open formulated, but this also leads to some problems. One thing is that the licensing condition and also the selection procedures differ very widely through Germany, because we have many different authorities in the Bundesländer or also in the municipalities that have had different approaches in licensing those regulatory sandboxes. And we heard just an example. We talked to colleagues from the company Clever Shuttle. They told us they operate their system in 8 different. It's something like Uber, car sharing, ride sharing offer, and they operate in 8 German cities under 8 different conditions. So just for example, in one city, they're allowed only to test their system with 5 cars, and in another city, they're allowed to test it with more than 100. Another problem of this very flexible and open formulation is that there is nothing regulated about the possibility of an extension. So we only have we had those 4 years to test it, but this was a problem. There was a problem that they don't have a perspective how this will go on after the test. Will there be an extension and things like that? And the fourth big problem, I guess, is I told you the good side. We learned from many projects, from many regulatory sandboxes for the amendment, but there was not really a good structured process of knowledge transfer from the regulatory sandboxes to the different authorities, and from the different authorities to the legislative process and to the ministry. That doesn't really work very well. It was more like an anecdotal evidence that we gained, that some of that we had. Yeah, there are different things that we could do better. One thing that was done better, just a very small thing in the amendment in August 21, was that the maximum period was extended from 4 to 5 years, but that's not too much at all. Next slide, please. But I also have a younger example. I brought a younger example for an experimentation clause where we try to do things better, also with the learning from the other experimentation clauses. This is an experimentation clause for testing enhanced vehicle systems for autonomous driving. These are very special systems for autonomous driving level 5 even. Here, I don't want to bore you with every detail, but just to pick out 3 points. The first thing is that we regulated that there will be the possibility of further extension of the testing period for another 2 years if the conditions still apply. Another thing here, number 4, is that we regulated that the authority has the task to collect, store, and use the data, also with the objective of the evidence-based development of the regulation. And the third thing here is that we took a more centralized approach here. Like I told you, in the other law, in the Passengers Transportation Act, we have many different authorities that produces transaction costs in different ways. And here we have one federal agency that has the task to approve, to evaluate, to support the projects. And we hope that this will be some kind of more efficient, at least in this case. So my point, yes, should be if you want to have successful if you want to have successful regulatory sandboxes, successful projects that help the companies to innovate, that allow for new innovations, and that also help you or help the regulator to learn about the things and to advance regulation, you have to very carefully draft the experimentation clauses. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, I would just very briefly want to tell you what we do in this concern. In Germany, we started in our ministry regulatory sandbox strategy in the end of 2018 with the aim of improving the legal conditions for regulatory sandboxes, especially. We have a few new experimentation clauses. I told you about autonomous driving, but another important and interesting field is the field of digital identities. So like digital registration for different procedures and in different fields. Then we have something unfortunately only non-obligatory, but Isa already told us about this on EU level, a so-called experimentation clause check in the legislative process. So to remind everyone who has to draft a new law in the field of innovation, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea just to think about the idea, to think of the possibility of a regulatory sandbox and of the possibility of experimenting before setting something in general. And we also we try to support the different ministries here and on the different levels, also on EU, with a guide for formulating those experimentation clauses. Next slide, please. And with this, our aim is to help step by step in formulating those elements and to make clear what is essential in a good working experimentation clause and what is perhaps more optional. This is, I'm sure this guide will not answer everything, and it has to remain a little bit of general, but I hope it's useful for you, and it's also the guide that we are using here in our team. Right, and next slide, please. Oh yeah, and you can download it. I put the download link, so you can, if you're interested, feel free to download it from our website. Next slide, please. And now I was talking about the national level, but of course this is a very important topic also on EU level, and we're very happy, Lorna, you told us already about it, about the council conclusions on regulatory sandboxes, and we also very much appreciate the work of the Commission in implementing those council conclusions and in taking this very seriously. Lorna already told us about how they do it, and yeah, I think it's very, very, very good. And also, we also appreciate very much, and Jodanka will tell us about it, the idea of artificial intelligence regulatory sandboxes, and especially the idea of further processing the personal data in those regulatory sandboxes. We already talked about the idea, and here this is also this AI sandbox. The idea is that this will really have give new opportunities for innovators in this, also in the field of data processing and in the field of AI systems. So yeah, we very much support it also as Germany. Okay, and next slide, please. On national level, just to finish this legal topic, we also have the task of a regulatory sandbox law by the new coalition agreement. This is something that we've proposed earlier to give some standards. Isa, you asked about this. But this shall not be a general experimentation clause that fits for every case, but these are more shall be more standards that apply for different experimentation clauses and regulatory sandboxes. And we try to and this law should also include new experimentation clauses for different areas. And last slide, please. And finally, I just want to mention what we also do. Besides this legal sphere, we also try to support the concrete regulatory sandboxes out there. We have a regulatory sandbox network with stakeholders. We have a handbook for regulatory sandboxes, practical guides, also for data protection in regulatory sandboxes. Very yeah, very important field, I think. We have a competition on this. We have information and workshops and things like that. And final slide, please. So if you're interested in perhaps in those informations and this handbook or something like that, feel free. We would be happy if you would come to our website that you can see here in English language also, or if you have any questions, please feel very free to contact me also afterwards. And so thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Constantine. It has been really, it's incredible to see this detailed level of information explained in such a clear way. And for me, it's always astonishing how much information member state can provide, can give to at the EU level. and I was not aware. I hope that Lorna was, and in any case, I think if she was not, she has a lot to dig in here. There were already some questions. So Javier, would you like to take the floor to explain your question, or should I say it for you?
I can do it myself. I was, I mean, because I work on a supervisory authority, I was wondering what was the role and the practical implication for the supervisory authorities in the context of the Huby example that you were mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. A very, very good question. The role was the main role of the authority was to allow for it, and I think there was also, and they had certain safeguards, for example, also in terms of evaluation and in terms of insurance, and they within this process they also checked for the safeguards if everything was in place and everything was fine. What they did not do was really to support and to give guidance. What we this is, I think, an aspect that we don't see that we could see more in our regulatory sandboxes, and this is perhaps a aspect that Jrc will speak about in her presentations, because in the AI regulatory sandboxes, there will be, I think, a bigger role of those agencies, of those authorities.
Yeah, thank you. And I see, so Katarzyna Walczak, sorry. Would you like to?
Yes.
Yes,
Bonjour,
please.
Cécile. Good morning, Constantine and colleagues. I have a question, so several questions. I wondered, of course, very inspiring, very advanced. You are really, let's say, pioneers, I would say. In my opinion, I haven't know a lot about it, but I have a question making an analogy. Some colleagues may know. Working for the European Commission on the European institutions, we have something which is called in the EU institutions pilot projects and preparatory actions. Why am I referring to this? Because this is the type of the animal which is proposed by the European Parliament to the European Commission, and it's called pilot projects, because very often they touch on the innovative services, products, and approaches as well. So I wondered, in this analogy, for example, the Commission, when we accept this pilot project preparatory action for the implementation for several years, 1 to maximum 3 years, then afterwards, if there is a success of this pilot project, whatever the area and the policy is, we have to turn it into the law. So I wonder if in the case of German examples, have you thought, Constantine, in regulatory sandbox law to make this proposal that if the project works well for 4 or 5 years, like it was the case, it will become an example to be spread out as a law. Because this is why we have this as an obligation. If something works well and can be, we as the Commission services, we have to think how to make it general and to make the benefit. I wonder if you have thought about it, because also this is one of my questions. And another question refers to the clauses that you have presented, which, as you said, were quite flexible. And also I wondered, but of course, maybe it was not the moment at this time to mention, in terms of the transport, I have seen that in here the clause was saying that idea of the project should not interfere with the transport policy. Here it was not mentioned on other policies, and it came to my mind that transport, this typical driverless transport, is also linked with the health policy and the security policy. But of course, probably these aspects, those aspects as well, they are covered under the transport policy, because I couldn't imagine that other policies would not be implied by this. So it's not about the transport, but very often other policies. Yeah, and I wonder if those clauses they take this into account when other policies they are implemented, because transport could be would say fine, this is fine with the transport policy for us, but in terms of the health or other aspects, rural development is not that obvious. So the other aspects probably they are also developed later on. So those are my questions. I hope that I explain myself clear. If not, I can specify.
Very clear, and thank you so much for those very, very excellent questions, because this is exactly what we are about, what we're thinking about. First thing, scaling up, and this is a point that the business federations always bring up. I saw a colleague from the BDE was in the call today. They say the companies have the problem, or they don't want to invest if they don't know what happens after the regulatory sandboxes. A regulatory sandbox is fine, but we need security. We need to know what will happen after this, and this is something that we don't have yet, and that we try to that should be part of those standards, that you can at least give a certain perspective for the participants of the regulatory sandboxes, that they have the possibility to scale it up in case this is successful.
Constantine, sorry to interrupt you. We are, we have Jrc who has to present still, and so could you write the rest of the reply into the chat? Is it possible?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Sure.
to be. I hate to do that.
No. You're very right. I'm sorry. Sure.
Okay. So, Zsofia, will you introduce Jrc?
Yes, of course, with pleasure. And I see Jrc exactly experimenting with all this flexibility, at least with working time, because she was just in another presentation and joined us in last minute. So a super big thanks for you, Jrc. You are working in the Commission, in the DG Connect area, and working with Artificial Intelligence Act, which has an experimentation clause around regulatory sandboxes. So I'm really curious where it stands, what will it bring, what do you expect when it's implemented in practice, and I guess our audience as well. So your floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and being part of this very interesting discussion, hearing also different experiences, and also having the opportunity now to present you a bit how we have tried to design the sandboxes in our recent proposal for artificial intelligence, which the Commission proposed in April last year, and which is now under discussion. So there are a lot of developments there, also a lot of interest on the sandboxes. So maybe I will start first a bit with presenting you the background, the rationale, and the objectives of how we thought about this when we proposed the Artificial Intelligence Act, but also update you a bit on the recent developments, because of course there is now an ongoing legislative process and there are many more ideas how this can be further strengthened and developed. And we want really to hear also views from different stakeholders, so it will be interesting also to hear from you. So just to say that maybe you know that our AI package, which we put forward in April last year, we have these twin objectives for artificial technology in Europe. We want really to create an ecosystem of excellence in Europe, to facilitate the development, to allow the broad uptake of this technology, because we think there are a lot of benefits in many areas. And at the same time, we also want to build this trust. So we really want to make sure that the technology performs as expected. It also respects our fundamental rights. It's safe. And we want really to combine this together and allow also this space for innovation. So the purpose of this is to have all our actions under the coordinated plan, but also our recent proposal for artificial intelligence. And there we really see the sandboxes as the place where you can achieve both objectives. You can really allow the experimentation, innovation, and have at the same time the trustworthiness and safeguards aspects with the help also of the regulators. So I'm going to talk more about this, but just also wanted to say that we were looking already at that time. It was a lot of developments have happened since then, but indeed we looked at the council conclusions on the sandboxes, and we were also inspired by other sandboxes that have been already established in different member states in areas. So we looked at from the financial sector, energy, data protection, automotive sectors. We saw that there are very diverse types of sandboxes. And indeed, for artificial intelligence technology, which is quite fast developing, we wanted to build that mechanism already in our proposal and to give a bit of a legal certainty and framework how this should operate, because it's true that for many legislations you can also envisage them without even specific framework or legal basis. You will certainly need that if you have these experimentation clauses where you give derogations, but it's not always necessary or obligatory part of the sandboxes. There can be different models. So we wanted a bit to set this framework already in our legal proposal, and that's why we have a chapter on innovation in the Artificial Intelligence Act, where we try to set the framework how AI regulatory sandboxes should be established and function for the purposes of our acts. We have set the objectives in the recitals of the regulation that this should aim to foster AI innovation by establishing this controlled and safe experimentation and testing environment. It should enhance legal certainty for innovators, how existing rules and frameworks apply to this innovative technology, but also this should bring also benefits to the competent authorities, because regulatory sandboxes are not just any business sandbox that can be created to test and experiment, but they really involve the competent regulators in the supervision process. And there are important takeaways that those competent authorities can learn from this supervision of the AI projects, because they can understand better the opportunities, emerging risks, impacts of AI use. They can better understand whether the existing legislation is fit for purpose, how the existing rules can be applied, and they can, of course, also exercise certain margin of discretion in this area, really looking onto the concrete projects and proposals, because we often have this how to say, abstract rules or requirements that are there, and when it comes to the actual implementation, it can vary a lot. And then these are really opportunities to accelerate the access to the market for those projects, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises and startups. We try to give priorities for those companies there in the sandbox, to the extent that they fulfill, of course, the other eligibility conditions, because we've also seen that there is more need to encourage and to support those actors, especially with new rules like the AI Act, which will be for first time applicable for those systems, and there will be a lot of need for legal certainty how these new rules apply and are implemented in practice for these AI systems that we are now going to regulate for first time. So here in our proposal, the key features of the regulatory sandboxes are set out in Article 53. And I have tried a bit to summarize them here, but indeed, as mentioned before, here the regulatory supervision is key, because these sandboxes should be established by competent authorities under our AI Act. So these are specifically designated by member states, or this can be also the European data protection supervisors for the EU institutions, because we have proposed that they act as a competent authority for us as institutions, bodies and agencies when we are also developing or using high-risk AI systems. But we have also tried a bit to have a broader perspective because our legislation is not in isolation. We have intersections with many other legal acts. And often when you develop one project, you have also to ensure compliance or you have legal uncertainty for many other acts that can be also associated. So that's why we allow also the opportunities for other regulators to be associated to the sandbox, and that will depend a lot on the case-by-case use cases. So the next important thing is that because our legislation is market-based legislation, so we try to set certain requirements that those systems have to fulfill already before they are placed on the market, and that requires a lot of testing, development, design, choices that are common for any other product that you also see on the European market. With these new requirements, for example, for accuracy, security, data quality, we have proposed that actually this pre-development and testing phase is supervised in the sandbox. It is also possible to test the system in real conditions because there is a lot of questions also how far you can go in this real testing. But because we need these conformity assessment procedures for our legal acts, and there was concern to completely give derogations or to avoid that step, because we are talking here mainly for high risks to fundamental rights, safety. At this initial stage of the proposal, we allow this possibility. It's possible to do this testing in real life, but actually there are certain limits where no effects real in market use can really happen. But this is a bit where we started, and I'll tell you that now the discussions are moving in different directions also with the co-legislators. And then the other objective of the sandbox was that the overall aim is really to give legal certainty, how we can fulfill those requirements that we proposed in the AI Act, but also we could, for example, see how existing legislation applies to these innovative technologies. For example, GDPR when it comes to different machine learning techniques, how you can demonstrate compliance with the principles or other sectoral laws, because it's also possible to combine it with existing sandboxes, like, for example, in the medical device sector or automotive, energy, where we also have certain use cases as high risk. And the supervision is, of course, here we're talking about concrete AI projects, systems that need to be developed, supervised, and tested in this sandbox. So they have to be innovative in our legislation because we thought we need to have certain focus on what kind of systems. Regulators don't have too many resources, so we have to have a certain innovation element, and there will be also more conditions for eligibility. So there is also the element of future beneficial users, but to support innovation, that was also an important part for us. Mainly, this will be set high-risk AI systems because they will have this binding new rules that are going to be applied in our legislation, but we could also supervise, it's open now, the text, we could supervise also other AI systems that are in a regulatory uncertainty. We don't know how the rules apply to them. They might be in great areas, or where the regulators might themselves want to supervise in case they want to adapt the existing rules, or they might want to, and we allow this also for our framework to keep it future-proof, to add more high-risk use cases in the future, also to take into account market and existing development. So we can do that through delegated acts without revising the core regulation. So those sandboxes could be also an opportunity to supervise systems to really see, are they high risk? Do we want to regulate them? And also we can certainly use that for for identifying possible barriers or problems or gaps in existing legislation and rules. And also, for example, in our case, the requirements or how the harmonized standards developed by European standardization organizations could be applied, but also to learn from our experience as the input for those standards. And here we also leave it open in our article because we can allow variety of possible participants, public, private, because we are a horizontal legislation. They can also participate in consortium. They can involve also other actors. But it is mainly focused on providers or manufacturers of those systems because it's really them, the key actors who have to place this really and fulfill the requirements in our act. Then on the next slide, I wanted a bit to show you, we have tried to address the governance framework because, as said, our legislation is going to be mainly enforced at national level by competent market surveillance authorities. So these will be really the authorities who can decide to set up those sandboxes. But they will be also able, and actually it's encouraged that they associate other relevant regulators when there are specific projects at stake, especially here it's relevant, the data protection authorities, if these are not the same authorities, because we have left it open in our act, which is the competent authority. We could also have other sectoral supervisory authorities, but we also look for synergies with other actors. Here, very important is the link with the data spaces that are now being created at Europe, also national level with the Data Act and the different other initiatives. With the testing and experimentation facilities, we also fund at European level and the hubs, because as we have really tried to leave it open, we don't really require this physical environment or virtual environment where the testing really takes place, because it of course place more burden on the authorities whether they can really create it, and that requires resources. But we think that of course it depends on every member state how many resources it can dedicate to this, to further allow cooperation with those kind of facilities, labs that may exist, and also data spaces where actually it's very important also to allow this and facilitate this access to the data for the development and testing of the AI system, which we know is a key element for AI. And then at European level, we try with this framework that we are creating here with these rules to set the common principles how these sandboxes should be operated. So we have at one hand the legislative and policy side, but at operational level, we also allow the opportunities to have cross-border European sandboxes where more member states cooperate and together scale up their resources and create a cross-border European sandbox. We'll also have the sandbox that can be created by the European Data Protection Supervisor, specifically for us as EU institutions, bodies and agencies. And then we think it's very important also for all national sandboxes to have this cooperation at EU level within the AI board and coordination. We'll have annual reports that will be submitted to the board with lessons learned, good practices, recommendations, so everyone can learn. And we can also provide this single access point to the sandbox for the EU. And on the next slide, I just want to say again that here we have the we don't propose derogations from our requirements because it was a bit challenging to say that, for example, your system don't have to be properly checked, documented, or and because we are talking here really for risks to fundamental rights, safety, but there are still discussions whether, for example, member states are now willing to go more into some member states are willing to go more into that direction of really experimentation or exceptions from existing obligations. We'll see how it goes. But we indeed, as said before, we give margin to the discretion of the regulators, how they apply the rules to the specific use case. And we create a special legal basis for the further processing of personal data in this Article 54, subject to certain safeguards, where we try a bit to, while still ensuring safeguards for people's data, to really facilitate a bit the reuse of already existing data. Now, for this article, there are also more discussions because some member states want to enlarge it and use it for more purposes, because we have allowed it only for certain types of systems in the public interest. So there are also new developments in this. And here, as I said, in the future, we're going...
Jordanka, I'm sorry, I need to stop you. So because we have 1 minute left and we need to wrap up. I try to push it as much as possible, but I'm sorry, and you have questions in the chat. I don't know if you would be kind enough to answer them now, and then I do the wrap up, because we will be over time otherwise. I'm sorry.
Yes,
your last slide, just show your last slide, and I hope you can. So there was a question also whether all participants, all presenters would be agreeing to share their slides. Is it okay that you share your slides?
Yes, of course. And I don't know, I cannot really see now the chat because I'm presenting, but...
okay, so the question, but it's EDPS sandboxes to give some more, so yeah, stop presenting, and if you can elaborate more on EDPS sandboxes and provide references. So now can we just wrap up? I will take 1 minute to just, I was really happy of this webinar where we see the legal environment meeting the innovation and providing a frame for innovation. So the case of that Jordanka, so of the AI regulation shows how an EU, so it's an attempt to have an EU frame for sandboxing, and so it was also a question to know what exists there, and we see that it's still a very, very emerging topic, but it's a fast evolutive topic. What I would like to just to wrap up, I think a key information that we need to consider is that this idea of creating a management of data management about the result of the sandboxing exercise to create evidence for policy making. And I think that for me, that was the key message. And it's the idea is to channel that to the people dealing with evidence transparency in the JRC. Then what do we have just to keep updated? Can you go to the next slide? So just keep in touch with us. And we will have more virtual breakfasts, most probably one in April. And then we publish regularly case studies, papers, and we also provide some training materials for you to take. Then you can join our discussions. So there are links and presentation that we will share, and you can subscribe to our newsletter or become a member to our community. So I'm really happy that I thank again the presenters. I think everybody was so happy of your super good presentation and super interesting. And also to the audience who was very, very sharing information in the chat. It was a very nice experience for us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.